It started like any other ordinary Wednesday. The kind of day where you move through the motions without thinking, still half asleep as you walk the school hallways, your mind cluttered with 100 unimportant things on, overdue assignment, a group chat argument, whether the cafeteria would actually serve the decent chicken tenders to the end. I remember thinking that nothing ever really happened at our school. Not in the way it did in the news, or in those terrifying viral stories. And that feeling of false security was exactly what made the first jolt of the intercom announcement feel so unreal. Like a bad prank or a teacher accidentally pressing the wrong button, because the voice that crackled over the PA wasn't our principal's steady tone but something urgent and almost shaking, telling us in clipped words that the school was going into immediate lockdown. And at first, there was this weird pause where we all kind of looked at each other, like, lockdown. Drill, right? But then, right before the teacher could even respond, we heard the faint echo of something metallic slamming in the distance, followed by another sound that, even now, I struggle to describe without my chest tightening, a sharp popping noise. That didn't belong in the walls of a school, and it was in that split second that my stomach dropped, and the energy in the room shifted from mild confusion to a fear so thick you could taste it in the air, and Mrs. Reynolds, her history teacher, moved faster than I'd ever seen her move, her face pale as she yanked the blinds closed and told us in a voice that brooked no argument to get down, away from the windows, away from the door, to stay silent. Not even a whisper, as she locked it and turned off the lights, plunging us into a dim, eerie half-dark, where every sound seemed amplified, from the rustle of someone's backpack to the faint hum of the overhead projector cooling down, and we all crouched in a huddle near the far wall, knees pressed to our chests, trying not to breathe too loudly, when suddenly we heard hurried footsteps pounding down the hall outside, heavier than a student's, followed by another burst of that awful popping sound, closer this time. And Samionameib, it was Dylan let out a muffled gasp, which Mrs. Reynolds silenced instantly with a finger to her lips and this look in her eyes that I'd never forget. This mix of fear and determination, the kind of look someone has when they know they're the only barrier between you and something unspeakable. And then came the worst part's voices, low and indistinct at first, then clearer, male voices, 2 of them, speaking in short, hurried sentences, one deeper, one higher, both moving slowly past our classroom door, their footsteps deliberate, as if they were listening for movement inside. And the deeper voice said something like, "Check the next one." And my pulse was hammering so hard I was sure it would be heard. And I remember the smell in that moment, to Simone's perfume mixing with the faint odor of dust and cleaning chemical sand, thinking how surreal it was that the world could feel so ordinary, and yet so dangerous all at once. And then without warning there was this sudden loud banging on a nearby locker, followed by running, and the voices fading, but the damage was done, because every creak of the building after that felt like the moment they'd come back, and time stretched into something unbearable, minutes crawling by as we sat there, legs going numb, ears straining for the slightest change. And then Boca's fear never comes. Just one Weiwei heard what sounded like a faint cry for help from the hallway, a voice that sounded young, maybe a student, whispering, "Please, somebody help me." But there was something off about it, something too steady and repeated, almost like a recording. And Mrs. Reynolds' eyes widened slightly, like she'd thought the same thing I did that. "It might be a trickend," she mouthed. "Don't move." So we stayed frozen as the sound moved away, and in that silence, I felt the enormity of what was happening hit me. This awareness that we were no longer in control of anything, that the safe, predictable bubble of school life had been punctured, and whatever was out there was not just random chaos, but deliberate. And as my phone buzzed in my pocket with a text from my mom, "Are you okay? There's news about the school," I didn't dare move to answer, because right then we heard the faint, metallic click of our classroom door handle being tried from the outside. Slow at first, then harder, rattling against the lock as my entire body locked up, every muscle tense, praying it would hold. And after what felt like forever, the rattling stopped at bet. The shadow under the door didn't move, staying there, unmoving, for an impossibly long time, as if someone was crouched right outside, listening. For what must have been a full minute though, it felt like an eternity. Thought shadow stayed perfectly still beneath the thin gap under the door, the faint light from the hallway cutting it into sharp relief, and I could feel the tension in the room, building to the point where even the smallest shift of a knee or swallow of breath felt deafening. Until, at last, the shape began to move away, slow and unhurried, as if whoever or whatever was out there knew exactly how much fear they were leaving behind in their wake. And I remember thinking in that moment that the real terror wasn't just in the danger itself, but in the deliberate way it unfolded, the patience in it, because it made you realize you weren't just unlucky, you were being hunted. And as the sound of those footsteps faded, replaced again by the oppressive silence, Mrs. Reynolds finally allowed herself the smallest exhale, though she didn't move from her position, crouched near the door, her ears still angled toward the hallway, every muscle in her body rigid. And just as I started to think maybe the danger had passed, the intercom crackled to life again, this time with a voice that wasn't the principal's, and wasn't even trying to sound like an authority. Figure eight was a man's voice, calm, almost casual, saying, "Everyone stay where you are. We'll be coming for you soon," followed by the sound of static, and then what I swear was muffled laughter, and the whole class seemed to shrink in on itself, eyes darting toward each other in shock and disbelief, and Mrs. Reynolds, her face pale but resolute, mouthed, "Don't believe anything you hear unless I say so," which only made my pulse race harder, because it meant she, too, knew there was no guarantee the systems we relied on for safety were still under control. And for the next half Horthuff, it could have been 10 minutes, or 3 hours, for all I knew. We sat in that stifling dark, flinching at every groan of the building, every distant thud, until a new noise reached us, the sound of hurried footsteps again, this time lighter, faster, like someone running full tilt, accompanied by the high, panicked sobbing of a girl. And before I could even process it, the running came right up to our door, and there was a frantic knock, not the deliberate rattling from before, but rapid, desperate pounding. And a voice, definitely a teenage girl's, this time pleading, "Please, let me in, please, they're coming." But Mrs. Reynolds didn't move toward the door, her hand, instead, motioning for us to stay low. And though part of me burned with guilt for not helping, the other part couldn't shake the possibility that this, too, could be a setup. And the pounding went on for a few seconds more before fading, the sobs trailing off into the distance, leaving us in that crushing uncertainty where every choice feels like a trap. And it was only when the fire alarm suddenly began blaring, relentless, echoing through the hallstead, I realized how close to breaking we all were, because half the class jolted as if to run, instinct overriding caution, but Mrs. Reynolds blocked the way, hissing under her breath that we weren't moving, that no matter what happened, we were staying put until law enforcement physically opened that door. And it was the right call, because seconds later, through the muffled chaos of the alarm, came that same deep male voice from earlier, now shouting, "Everyone out. This way." And if we'd listened, we would have walked straight into whatever was waiting out there. And I think that was the moment I understood we weren't just hiding from danger. We were in the middle of something organized, something that had thought about this, planned for it. And that realization made the next sounds all the more terrifying, a series of sharp cracks, closer than before, followed by what sounded like furniture being overturned, screams echoing from somewhere else in the building. And then abruptly everything stopped, the silence slamming down again like a physical weight. And it was in that eerie stillness that we heard it, the faint, tinny notes of music drifting through the hallway, some kind of old song, scratchy, like it was playing from a record player, completely out of place, in the fluorescent-lit corridors of our school. And as those notes grew louder, closer, my breath caught because the footsteps were back, slower this time, perfectly in time with the music, until they stopped right outside our door again, and the handle began to turn it, rattling now, but deliberate, like someone savoring the attempt, and, just as I thought the lock might actually give, there was an explosion of shouting from farther down the hall. Deep, authoritative voices yelling commands, the thud of boots on tile, and the sudden, violent sound of a struggle breaking out, followed by more of those sharp pops, and in the chaos that followed, the shadow under the door vanished, replaced by a flash of light as the door was thrown open out by the intruder, but by two armed officers in tactical gear, their faces set and focused as they told us to move, to keep our heads down and follow them. And as we spilled into the hallway, the smell hit me first, a mix of gunpowder and something metallic that I don't even want to name, followed by the sight of lockers dented and overturned, scattered papers, and, at the far end of the hall, a figure in dark clothing being dragged away in cuffs, their face hidden. But what froze me in place, what will always freeze me in place when I think about that day, was the fact that they were laughing, a low, almost joyful sound that didn't belong to someone who had just been stopped. And as we were hurried outside into the blinding daylight, past the chaos of sirens and panicked parents, I caught one last glimpse over my shoulder of the open doorway to our classroom, and there, just inside, lying neatly on the floor where the intruder must have placed it, was a small, old-fashioned tape recorder still playing that scratchy, looping voice we'd heard earlier, whispering for help.